Hello and welcome to Greenwald. And today I'm here with my longtime interlocutor and one of the few people who knew me before I was on the left at all, Alex Strekal. And we are talking about three pieces Alex wrote for a Substack on the Spectre of alternative politics. And Alex, you are basically the only person other than me who actually thinks there is a direct relationship between Ron Paul politics and Bernie Sanders politics and Trump politics. I mean, a lot of people and a lot of even standard liberals think there's a direct relationship between Bernie Sanders politics and Trump politics. See Bernie Bros and MAGA communist. But I think the precursor to all that in the anti-war wing of the paleo-conservatives trying to court a youth vote in the aughts during the Bush administration was effectively erased from everyone's public memory by actually not even by Trump, by Barack Obama's winning in 2008. And the reason why I mentioned that you and I have known each other for a long time, when I was a paleo-conservative and you were a libertarian, so now this is 20 years ago at the wee early days of Facebook.
That's right.
You and I encountered each other around debates about the Ron Paul campaign and its aftermath in 2004. Now, I was not a supporter of Ron Paul. His association with Lew Rockwell and the Neo-Confederates had always concerned me. But it was amazing to me how many young people did not know that back in the day. So I want to get to your piece. How would you frame the Ron Paul phenomenon from 20 years ago? Actually,
yeah, I mean,
more than 20 years ago now.
I mean, as part of, well, I have three pieces here that you're referring to, and it does start speaking about Ron Paul, and that was kind of my own entrance into politics, even though, to be clear, I actually had progressive parents, but the beginning of my independent political consciousness was the libertarian movement. And at the time, Ron Paul was one of the main people who would suck in young people and lead you to lewrockwell.com and then Mises.org. And even though I was kind of liberal or progressive in my beginnings in a way, I got sucked into that because it was an alternative politics in a sense. And there were certain senses in which people who had progressive leanings actually got sucked into that orbit, partly because of the anti-war sentiment.
Yeah. Rob Reich used to talk about Ron Paul positively all the time on Left, Right, and Center back, in the day when I would still listen to stuff like that, and it did make me want to vomit. And I think a lot of people even miss that the branding was similar. Do you remember the Revolution stuff that out of the Ron Paul campaign? And
what exactly? No, go ahead.
The revolution, but it was Revolution.
Yeah. So now that you're clear about that, yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, it was marketed that way. There was a tagline. Yeah, and it was called the Ron Paul Revolution. And yeah, I mean, it was a strange time to think back on because it was the anti-war thing, and to a certain extent, it was also just the libertarian pretense of I guess civil libertarianism in a sense of being left alone to smoke pot or whatever. That kind of dragged people who were progressives into it too. But a big thing, part of it was the anti-war movement, which of course was ultimately set to rest under Obama, and everyone went to sleep again and forgot about it. But yeah, no, it was the Ron Paul thing that majorly sucked people in from it. And to be clear, I actually ended up arguing against voting for Ron Paul, even when I was a libertarian. And even when I was briefly an anarcho-capitalist, my motivations for being into it was more abstract or philosophical. And I always opposed the paleo-libertarians who were super reactionary. But you couldn't help but run into those people when you were in the libertarian movement back in the day.
Yeah, I mean, it was right before a former Marxist and friend of mine, Michael Rectenwald, of left communist turned anti-woke professor turned temporary head of the Von Mises caucus in the Libertarian Party, almost their presidential candidate until he screwed it up at the last minute.
I was late to the game about learning about him, but I was shocked to learn. Yeah, I saw that he joined the Mises Institute, but I learned about his controversy back when he was still, I guess, a Marxist professor at New York NYU. It was,
Mm-hmm.
but
Yeah,
I guess he started some blog under a pseudonym, and then people discovered that it was really him, and he definitely was having like a public mental breakdown, from what I could tell too.
Oh yeah, he was associated with Lauren Goldner and a lot of left communists, and he actually wrote for me as well as Insurgent Notes. He wrote a defense of Mark Fisher's Vampire Castle piece, as well as a discussion about changing attitudes towards religion in the Marxist left that we were co-writing a book on, and then the beginnings of the NYU scandal fell apart. But he was very much in that milieu. He even was my successor at the North Star for a few months. He probably doesn't ever want to talk about it again. And I say this because by and large, more people go that way than the way I went, which is from the paleo-conservative right during the Ron Paul period was actually, and I don't talk a lot about this specific, because I didn't vote for Ron Paul either. My first foray into electoral politics was the debate in the Reform Party in 2000 between somebody who's going to come up at the end of this, Donald Trump, who was running as more moderate to Pat Buchanan in 2000, as the successors to, weirdly, Ralph Nader in that party. So the Reform Party had come out of Ross Perot, but it had passed its torch to this unity ticket of green/reform to Nader. And when that didn't go well in 2000, I guess that must have been 2006, Pat Buchanan ran for the Reform Party platform, and we all know kind of how that went. And he was opposed by the first presidential run of Donald Trump, which is where that famous, Simpsons predict Trump presidency comes from. The first time that was actually because they were commenting on his running for the Reform Party candidacy in competition with Pat Buchanan in 2000. And what I think is interesting to talk about when we talk about the specter of alternative politics and the libertarian movement in particular is that I was coming at it from the paleo-conservative view, but my form of paleo-conservatism was very influenced by a lot of the same people you had talked about. I had been pulled into, when I was 21 years old, into the Justin Raimondo end of antiwar.com, which people today, when I mentioned that was a right-wing outlet and kind of still is a right-wing outlet.
It definitely was. I mean, LouRockwell.com linked right to it, and it was a lot of the same people.
Right. They published a lot of like far left progressives on antiwar.com, and they also had an overlap with Counterpunch, which people often ignore.
Interesting.
At that point, Alex Coburn was really trying to build something like a paleo-conservative far-left coalition.
Well, something I did see, even like following when I look back at LouRockwell.com, which I occasionally spy on, it's a weird website, but they will like selectively platform progressives or left-wing people. They even had Gabriel Coco write for them at one point.
Yeah, they have at times done really strange things, like ran a defense and celebration of Derrida when he died.
Really? I didn't catch that one.
Oh yeah, I mean it was. They published the unedited version of Murray Rothbard's, Left and Right, where Rothbard was literally talking about making allegiances with Maoists.
I would have a word about that. That was in what, like the late 60s, early 70s, and people do talk about that from the left libertarian camp I should couch this in the left libertarian camp of the market anarchists, which is kind of a weird thing in and of itself. But they would appeal to this left Rothbardian thing. And there was this brief period where Rothbard, yeah, he was allied with the New Left and the hippies, mostly over anti-war stuff. But then, if even way as far back as like 1974, once he writes egalitarianism as a revolt against nature, like he turns against them and makes pretty clear that he's a right winger.
Oh yeah, I mean he starts siding with neo-Confederates, and I mean
Yeah.
even sometimes defending, and not just in the ACLU sense, defending neo-Nazis, like beyond their right to free speech.
Yeah.
He also defended, as did Lew Rockwell later, Rushdoony and Gary North, who were actual Dominionists, the people that everyone thought the Bush administration kind of was, although they weren't at all.
Yeah, the thing about Gary North that I recall is him advocating bringing back public stonings.
Yep. And my introduction to the libertarian instantiation of the cult around Stefan Molyneux before he went all weird Canadian hyper-nationalist was on LewRockwell.com. And as was my introduction to things like Joe Sobran and Evola. So this idea, the very weird neo-traditionalist stuff would also occasionally make its way into that milieu, but it was in the weirder end of it because they weren't really libertarians. But you could find people on Lew Rockwell that were one step down from being tied to Greca or Alain de Venise, even though those people are anti-libertarian to their core.
Yeah. Well, it was definitely a confusing environment to maneuver in. Like, I would say, yeah, especially from about 2006 to 2010. Well, it actually goes back earlier than that for me. It was about around 9/11 that I got politicized, and then I got into it. But my motivations for it at the time was, it was the anti-war thing. It was the more abstract anti-statism that leads you into a sort of anarchist pipeline. And it was abstract philosophical questions about rights and property and things like that, which I ended up thinking my way out of their positions pretty quickly, actually. But there was a brief time in which I basically was an anarcho-capitalist. But even when I was an anarcho-capitalist, I would run into these people like especially Hoppe. Once Hoppe wrote "Democracy: The God That Failed," that definitely was a big controversial thing that split the movement in a way, because it was all of a sudden people were arguing for nationalism and strict immigration control, and they were hanging around with people who really were white nationalists and neo-Nazis, basically right around the corner.
Yeah, and Hoppe went even for. I think that one of the things about that people miss. Hoppe went so far as to argue that feudalism was actually more capitalist than capitalism was because it was a private form of the state.
Yes.
Right?
Well, he argued that monarchy is better than democracy because it's private, and he argued that on the sort of ideological grounds of private proprietarianism that ANCAPs are super into. And in a sense, when I look back at it, I would describe him as fully owning the consequences of the ANCAP view, while others didn't. Others with more liberal inclinations wanted to make it something it really wasn't and paint a happy face on it. When in a sense, Hoppe, yeah, he fully owns the consequences of that view. Although some might frame him as imposing his cultural conservatism on it, I guess.
Right. Well, you and I both also came through a period. This is a period I don't talk about much. And I think this is you and I encountered each other in this exact moment of transition. I was also radicalized by 9/11 and radicalized towards the left by the failure of Barack Obama, but almost immediately in the Obama campaign. But like by the time of the appointment of his cabinet, I was already like, I'm out. But it's interesting because when people talk about, for example, Glenn Greenwald today, and they talk about the weirdness of his politics, I actually don't find it that weird. What has happened with Glenn is that his ability, because of the change in the market, to do what he's actually good at, which is international war reporting, has been dramatically limited. But in a weird way, Glenn Greenwald has kind of been everywhere that I have ended up being in about the same time. So during this time period we're talking about, he was aligned with Ron Paul.
He was. I'm pretty sure he
Then
was featured on Lou Rockwell at some point.
all the time. I used to read him all the time on Lou Rockwell. I don't know that he published this directly. One of the things about Lou Rockwell is they would syndicate stuff that they didn't really always tell you the source.
Mm-hmm.
But I read him all the time on Lou Rockwell back in the day, and on antiwar.com. Then when I moved left, he seemed to move left with me. Like, we were part of the anti-war end of the socialist. Now, he was never a socialist, but he was showing up at like the ISO's conference in, I forget, the early 20-teens. And the Intercept, went under his leadership when they first opened, was very much we're aligned with progressives if they're actually anti-war, and we want to bring this back to the forefront. And him and Jeffrey Scahill were all about that. It's very different than, the Ryan Grimm team today. And as he moved with where he could get an audience, frankly, it did seem like he had like two concerns. One is you can't trust Democrats, and the other is you can't really trust establishment Republicans. And it's interesting today when I talk to younger people who just do not get that there was an anti-Bush right.
There absolutely was. But
Right.
It was the whole neoconservative versus paleo-conservative split in some ways. And the libertarians took that up. And it was the libertarians versus neoconservatives. And a lot of Ron Paul's rhetoric was like fiercely anti-neoconservative.
Yeah. If you were a peace person in 2004, your only viable candidate in 2004 who did not vote for the war in any way
was Ron Paul.
Or you're voting third party.
And otherwise, the only other person I would associate with, I guess, Dennis Kucinich was similar in some ways.
Yeah. And I will admit, in this time period, because I was coming out of being a paleo-conservative, I didn't stay in that movement very long, but it was slow going. And I was weighing my options. I was like, okay, do I back the Green Party? Do I back Dennis Kucinich, or I don't know, Dennis Kucinich in the Democratic Party? Do I back Ron Paul in the Republican Party? Do I back, I think it was Gary Johnson. I can't remember what
I think he was the one. Yeah, 20. What period are you talking about here?
2004. In 2008, it's Bob Barr, when Bob Barr renounces.
Because I remember Gary Johnson, but I don't remember exactly what year that was.
Yeah.
And then it was Bob Barr, and then honestly, even when I was a libertarian, I never joined the party. I was a rogue anti-electoral anarchist type.
Well, what I wanted to talk about the specter of this alternative politics is the Ron Paul stuff actually went two ways. And we have kind of forgotten about one way it went. All right. So I signed on to the Houston Manifesto, and this is a really embarrassing part of my life, in 2005, 2006, as part of the anti-war camp of it, but who was opposed to people like, I don't know, singing the praises of various, Islamic theocracies. And so I didn't want to go there. And I got kind of involved in the politics around the anti-Sam Harris end of the New Atheist movement. So the people who would later on be called like Atheism Plus. And there's a lot of embarrassing stuff in this time period. We don't
absolutely there was.
It's funny because I talk about, the left and the millennial left, but we're like anti-war stuff. Cough, cough. We're not going to mention anything between 2004 and 2010, except for Barack Obama, because it's all really weird. And I remember just trying to go through this. And one of the things that your piece really spoke to me about is this attempt for an anti-systemic politics, like in the developed world. And before 2007, Marxism wasn't on the fucking radar. And I think people really don't get that. Like, yes, there were these old Marxist sects. They still existed, but they were mostly not of any consequence.
Yes. When I look back at it, and this is part of my analysis, is that, back in the, 9/11 Bush Jr. days, It's like it almost seems natural that the libertarians were the natural like alternative politics, quote unquote, because the Soviet Union falling was still pretty recent. And I did encounter Marxists online, but it seemed like it was de facto like the libertarians had a huge marketing campaign. They had these political compass tests that almost seemed slanted to convince you that you were a libertarian
Oh
in
yeah,
some ways. Um,
yeah. I
and
don't
yeah,
think almost seems slanted.
I mean, they were.
They were slanted
They
like.
were. They were. Um, Maybe I'm being a little too kind to it in that way.
I mean, I think the other thing that we have to remember is today libertarianism's almost completely faded as a politics. After Ron Paul tried it one last time in 2012, it's been kind of over.
I mean, it's ineffective and is never gonna get anywhere. I mean, it's a dead end. I concluded that a while back. I pretty much by the time of 2010, I concluded that I no longer wanted to be a libertarian, and in some ways, my entire output for 5 years on various blogs was just anti-libertarian shit, shaving off my own former beliefs and associations. But yeah,
Yeah.
the movement is totally ineffective, and of course, more recently, there was the whole Mises Caucus takeover. Um, and yeah, they still run candidates sometimes who are more like traditional, like social liberal, what I would call rainbow capitalists now, but basically socially liberal, fiscally conservative types. But I
I mean,
don't.
that's who won actually this last time when Trump and the Von Mises caucus and one of the last, let's say, Reason magazine type libertarians went against
Yes.
each other. And the other thing that we forget is the people who are being defeated. And it's interesting because I remember in the early aught teens, there were all these books about Ayn Rand. And I was like, oh, you guys write about her now that she's not that important.
Mm,
Um, but she was a super dominant force in the right from the Reagan period, but also in the libertarian left. But what was interesting about the Ron Paulites is they opposed the Randites because
yes, they did.
Randian objectivist,
They were pro-war as fuck and pro-Israel as fuck.
right? They were neoconservatives in foreign policy.
Yes, they were, and that is something I talk about in one of my later articles on this. Is that, yeah, and I think sometimes liberals and progressives don't have the best critiques of libertarianism because they're not privy to the different factions like this. There's the paleo-libertarians and there's the neo-libertarians who were more aligned with Ayn Rand Institute and objectivists, and they were more privy to neoconservatives. They had more of a neoconservative angle as well as being staunch atheists as well. Um, which
As
was very
opposed to
different
like,
as
yeah.
opposed to the paleo-conservatives who were like anti-war and aligned with the paleo-libertarians who were aligned with the paleo-conservatives and usually courted religious people a lot.
And it's
Um,
really weird to tell people about this now, but progressives often read American Conservative Magazine because it was the only conservative magazine, and actually one of the few magazines at all. I mean, The Nation and Mother Jones were the other ones that were opposed to the Iraq War,
mhm.
right? Like, if you wanted to read anti-Iraq War opinion before 2004, all right, you were most likely going to read the American Conservative under the auspices of Taki, of Taki Mag fame, who's
Mhm.
and Pat Buchanan, and then Kevin Williams. And Kevin Williams wrote a bunch of books and Ron Dreyer was part of it too, but Ron Dreyer comes later. Kevin Williams wrote a bunch of books. I think it's Kevin Williams. This is about he has the most normie name ever. It's a Kevin guy who maybe it's Kevin Johnson. Wrote a bunch of books about the Bush family that a lot of progressives read, and these people were also pushing a lot of like left-wingish books on American foreign policy. So like Chalmers Johnson's Blowback, I read as a paleo-conservative influenced by libertarians. Like, and I try to get people to understand this because it makes certain weirdnesses that happen in the Obama administration around stuff like Counterpunch magazine make a little more sense, because that's when the left tries to do the same thing, but Coburn's making all these concessions to these nationalists who are also nominally anti-war. Think about Alex Coburn's equivocations on Le Pen and him allowing Israel Samir to publish at Counterpunch. If you guys don't know who Israel Shamir was, he was basically a Holocaust denialist from Russia. And that was really turning people off. There was also this expose in Reason magazine against LouRockwell.com for their support of Gary North and Rushdoony, and the fact that they were like hiding neo-Confederates, and
it was really, honestly, it was like difficult for them to ever even hide. But I mean, you could say there was an esoteric creed and an exoteric creed, where the exoteric creed was more classical liberal. You're talking about liberty and being against the state and just, pure individualism. And then next thing you know, yeah, you're talking to neo-Confederates and people who, and so especially due to Hoppe's influence, like you were talking to people who kind of idolized European aristocracy too. It got weird in that way.
I mean, particularly in the von Mises world.
Yes.
And they would also call all Keynesianism fascism because of the relationship to the state. Which, by the way, if people, the Marxist Jehu, people may not know this, comes out of the milieu just like me. And when you know that, certain weird opinions that he has about like abandoning the gold standard as the beginning of fascism makes perfect sense. It doesn't come from Marxism, although you can find it there if you really try. It comes from the fact that he came out of the Ron Paul movement. Other things out of the Ron Paul movement: cryptocurrency, defunding everything.
Well, I was thinking in the back of my mind here, as far as we were talking about Ron Paul, like another part of his platform was ending the Federal Reserve, which in a strange sense you may think is counterintuitive for a capitalist ideologue to take up, being against a big bank. But they had their reasons, if you understand Austrian economics, going back to Mises, about why they're against central banking. But that was one of the big hobby horse topics of them, is ending the Federal Reserve too.
Yep. And every now and then you will still see people who will confuse leftist anti-finance capital stuff, which is usually suspect anyway. Not that I'm pro finance capital, but if you think the problem with capitalism is just finance capital, that's usually a sign of other problems. With stuff about the Federal Reserve and real money, which is kind of crazy. And I came out of that world, so did you, and we also went through this weird piece. There's this guy named Roderick Long. You would probably remember.
I knew. He was influential on me for a second because he was associated with the Mises Institute, but he was oddly like the left wing of the Mises Institute, if you want to call it that.
I mean, he admitted racism was a problem. Didn't like neo-Confederates. Didn't like supporting dictators abroad. I mean, like he was anti-war. He was just a rabid anarcho-capitalist.
He was.
But did think racism and sexism were actual things, which in that milieu was rare. And then around him,
Kevin Carson. Then comes Kevin Carson, and that was, to be honest, like I have a lot of retroactive criticisms of Kevin Carson. However, I have to give him some credit. He was part of what led me and quite a few other people towards anti-capitalism, because he wrote these pieces establishing that capitalism is not a free market system independent of the state. That there is a certain relationship of the state supporting capitalism. Of course, these days I would go further and I would argue that there's no such thing as the concept of a free market itself is kind of an ideological shibboleth in a sense. So I would go further than Kevin Carson in some ways, but that was an influential thing through mutualism, or neo-mutualism, perhaps properly called, that led people out of the ANCAP thing and more into real anarchism, quote unquote.
Right. So for me, around the same time, I was never truly an anarchist, in the sense that I have never been totally against the state in immediate abolition form. This has always been like, and again, this was true when I was a paleo-conservative. I did think it would be better not to have a state, but I was like, it'll be a billion years. So it was. This was sort of my mentality about it. I was, and I had gotten pulled into this, and this you don't go into, but I think it's actually really important to remember why the anti-globalization movement became the alter globalization movement was actually what happened to people like me, because my first exposure to Pat Buchanan was I wasn't raised progressive. My stepfather was a Ross Perot supporter in '92. My mother was a conservative Democrat.
Okay.
And I don't know my father's politics. He was a con artist, so it doesn't really matter. But so that's the milieu I came out of. I was initially attracted to progressivism, but the Clinton administration gave me the ick even when I was a teenager.
I don't feel like I ever was. I wouldn't say it gave me the ick, but like I was a little bit too young to like give a shit about Clinton. And I will say that intuitively, my experience of Democrats from the beginning of being politically conscious was that they kind of just seemed like used car salesmen with a happy face.
Yeah, as
Um,
opposed to Reaganite conservatives who seemed like defense dealers as used car salesmen. It was kind of like who was I dealing with and how were they conning me was my attitude
yeah.
as a teenager. Um, and the alternative politics even in the 90s was kind of libertarian, or it was like this weird everything in the kitchen sink anarchism that, you know, from Chomsky and whatnot. And this was another interesting thing because your piece, I talk about Bernie, but I think there was actually a deliberate effort to pull in people like me when they encountered stuff like the Battle for Seattle. What got me was I went to the Battle of Seattle. I participated. I was barely 18 years old. It was my first trip to the West Coast at all. I had saved up months of money to go. And my experience of it was this weird fight with the cops. And then the next day, people declaring that we won because of some paltry concessions from, the G8. And I remember thinking, even at the time, as an 18-year-old who was barely political, like, my idea of politics was like, the Clintons gave me the ick, and I think Rage Against the Machine is cool. But also what happened at Ruby Ridge was bad. That was like my understanding of politics. Like, so I was like, yeah, Mumia Jamal and Leon Peltier, that shit sucks. That shouldn't have happened to them. Also, I don't, even if that guy, Randy Reaver, was a right nationalist, and I still am not 100% sure he was, what happened at Ruby Ridge is unforgivable, and Waco was stupid. So that was my politics in my teens, right? Which is a very, I'm not going to say incoherent mix, but I think it is morally coherent, but ideologically all over the place.
Sure. That makes sense. Because you didn't know what you didn't know.
Right. Right. And I never argued that like Randy Reaver or Waco was good. I just argued that killing children is bad.
Sure. Hopefully so. Hopefully you did.
And it seemed like there was, between the drug war and the proto-war on terror, a real police state threat coming.
And that was definitely part of the libertarian appeal, was arguing against the police state and the Patriot Act and the erosion of privacy that was basically, and the rise of executive power that was handed to Bush, and the critique continued under the Obama administration about how they continued and expanded all of it.
And you and I were interesting because you and I knew each other during this time period, and we're still searching for an anti-systemic politics, right? And we can come back to Ron Paul for a second and the weird milieu, because this Ron Paul libertarian stuff, it does maintain itself up through the first half of the Obama administration. I do believe, like it's still a dominant thing, and it is not yet re-redded to the kind of proto-patriot, proto-MAGA movement. And I bring that up because today a lot of people will tell you like the Tea Party was astroturfed, and it was after the fact. But the initial Tea Party was actually, and I know people are gonna have a hard time remembering this, a protest against George fucking Bush.
Yeah.
And then it moved to a protest
I,
against.
I remember as a
Go ahead.
libertarian that, yeah, some of my libertarian friends got into the Tea Party. I never did.
Mhm.
I was already moving left libertarian by that point, basically. But yeah, it was a little bit more organic than a purely AstroTurf thing at first. I think that's probably true.
I mean, well, the founders even condemned it. Remember, like in 20, like by the time of the midterm takeover in 2010, like the original OG 2006 2007 Tea Party founders were like, no, this has been totally hijacked by the Republican Party. So, I mean, it was an interesting thing because the initial Tea Party seemed to come out of the Ron Paul part, but it very quickly moved to a resurgence of the moral majority of the 1990s.
I think that's part of what put me off of it. It was just like, okay, this is just a conservative thing.
Right. The Ted Cruz's of the world and the Michelle Bachmans and Sarah Palin's and all that. And I'm like, oh, this is like a joke form in a more openly racist form of the bullshit I saw in the moral majority in the 90s against Clinton, right? What I find interesting about that is that if we'd have really been aware, and you and I were actually in a position to do it, and I kind of kicked myself in the ass for not realizing it at the time, about where the Ron Paul movement was going, we would have seen how easy that would have been to happen. But since we came to it in a search for an anti-war, anti-systemic politics, it was really cut off from both the Clinton-era Democrats of my teen years and the Reagan / neo-Reagan, neoconservative of the Reagan and Bush W years. Now, George Herbert Walker Bush is a different breed. He was more of a Nixonite in a way, but that I didn't want anything to do with either of those politics, right? They both seemed like weird baby boomer bullshit that I didn't want to have to deal with. And I remember, you and I met. I think you probably met around 2006 because you were heading Libertarian Left, and I was heading.
That sounds about right. I would pinpoint it around 2006, and you said it. Yeah, I've actually, looking way back through my Facebook messages, I think I jokingly sent you some message like, Marxist, Marxist, Marxist. You were becoming a Marxist,
right?
And I was effectively becoming a social anarchist.
Right. No. Way back, there was antagonism between us. So
I think it was half jokingly though, but yeah, I was like I was kind of prodding you, but yeah.
But it's very interesting to look at the libertarian road and where it went, because we should have been able, from what we saw with Hans Hermann Hoppe and the weird paleo-conservative stuff and the weird relationship with Pat Buchanan and all that, we should have been able to see that a large part of the libertarian movement was very open towards radically statist, radically anti-market stuff.
Yes.
If they got put in a corner.
I touch on this in my most recent piece where we start talking about Trump and the alt-right. And what I did personally see firsthand around the 2010 period is there was this shift where people who formerly were like right-wing anarcho-capitalist types, they did suddenly, first of all, they were talking to certain people who were like white nationalist types, and there was a certain degree of entryism going on for sure, where white nationalist types were framing themselves as anarchists and pulling people their way. But it also, I distinctly saw certain people, they sort of resolved their cognitive dissonance of like, since they were getting into racial politics and nationalism, at the same time trying to be anarchists, and there was just this weird cognitive dissonance to that, and I was one of the people arguing against that, like how could you be an anarchist while arguing for nationalism. And the way that some of these people resolved their cognitive dissonance was to let go of the libertarian label and just go more mask off with a more nakedly authoritarian approach. And that was kind of the birth of the alt-right before it was called the alt-right. A lot of it, in my opinion, came from not necessarily paleo-libertarianism, but certainly like the racist wing of that.
So I can just confirm your suspicions directly.
Yeah.
Richard Spencer, I knew about him from him being the arts editor of the American Conservative magazine before he started working with the National Policy Institute, NPI, which is unfortunately in my home, not my hometown that I grew up in, but the hometown I was born in, Augusta, Georgia. And which is basically, the NPI is a very soft sounding. There's nothing scary about the National Policy Institute. It's been right nationalist from the beginning. It's basically been a neo-Nazi front for forever. I remember learning about. I remember learning about it because one of the things that was very weird, and and something that maybe should give people some pause. I was very familiar with the Frankfurt School when I was a paleo-conservative. Believe it or not, I kind of had a boner for Adorno even when I was conservative, which I think
it's kind of surprising. Yeah,
not totally surprising. And I knew about Paul Gottfried as early as 2004.
Okay.
Maybe even earlier. So I saw the formation of this attempt to, in America, build the equivalent to the French New Right in Europe. And for those of you who don't know, the French New Right is basically a form of post-fascism. I mean, it's a mixture of national Bolsheviks, radical traditionalists, former Nazis, and Le Penites, right? Like, that's what it is. And they were working their way through the weirder parts of the American anti-systemic counterculture. So if you have been into something like Feral House Press, which was, just a countercultural thing, seemed totally cultural, you would be exposed to maybe Alain de Benoit's On Paganism, or the weird neo-folk music, some of which I aesthetically still kind of like, even though I don't really rock its politics at all. I don't want to give them any money. But there was a lot of these, like, thinly veiled, we're not Nazis, but we are kind of fascist. Maybe we kind of think Oswald Mosley was cool, or National Syndicalism was cool, or Strasser was cool.
What I remember was encountering people who it's like, yeah, they would have Hitlerite revisionism videos. They would have videos attacking Martin Luther King from a racist angle, not just some leftist critique or something. But
they would have like Bircher shit too.
Yeah, but they were also talking to anarchists, and like some of them even like tried to frame themselves as socialists.
Troy Southgate, former member of the British National Front, who moved to the United States and wrote for Green Anarchy magazine in the 90s before they realized who he was. It was the founder in the late aughts of the National Anarchist movement.
And that was one of the weird things that was contentious at the time. Yes, the National Anarchist thing, which I guess was more of a British thing, I suppose, right? I didn't even realize that.
British and West Coast. That was the thing. It was British
Bay
initially,
Area,
and they
Bay
moved it
Area.
to the Bay Area. Yeah.
Yeah, that part I knew, the Bay Area thing, but I didn't know until later that it was kind of a British thing, actually. But yeah, that was one of the controversies, and since I was with the left libertarians at the time, there was this big and there was another guy named Keith Preston who he flirted with the National Anarchists, though I actually had a weird encounter with him recently, and he claims that he only ever was like on the edges of them and never really supported them, I guess, but whatever.
He also flirted with the alt-right explicitly, running stuff on the alt-right readings of Carl Schmitt, and interfacing with a group called New Resistance, which used to be American Third Position. For those of you who don't know, that's explicitly neo-Nazi.
It is.
And they were at the time also the people running the Friends of Juice in America. So I bring this up because when people talk about MAGA communism, they think nothing like this has ever happened before. But on the fringes of this Ron Paul movement, and on the fringes of the very, very far left, and I don't mean to be a horseshoe theory, but this is true, there was a lot of this weird shit coming off in the anti-war movement. And when I said I signed the Houston Manifesto, this was forever ago, it was encountering these guys when I was on the paleo-conservative right that scared the shit out of me.
Makes sense.
pushed me into that direction. And then by 2000, between 2004 and 2006, I was like trying to figure out how to reconcile myself to practical politics and opposing the Bush administration, and even like maybe voting for a Democrat for the first time in my life. And this pool of anti-systemic politics, I think people think it's new, but they're talking about the great transitionary period, right, or the great realignment. What I reading your stuff is like there's been an attempt to do realignments in American political life basically constantly since the 1970s.
Yeah, it would
It's
seem
been
so.
nonstop. Like, go ahead.
No, that's correct. Although I'm not sure my critique's I don't quite touch on it as far back as the 70s, perhaps. But certainly, I do focus on. It's relevant, the 90s and the fall of the Soviet Union. It's also relevant talking about the anarchist movement because post-left anarchism especially became a thing in the 90s.
Which is different from post-left, whatever the fuck the post-left is now. But
I know it's a different meaning. There's like 3 different meanings of that now, I guess. As I've seen you say, yeah, there's the post-left anarchism, and then you could say post-left Marxism, I guess.
I would say post-left social democracy because most of them are social democrats, and I consider the OG post-left were the anti-left of capital left communists. So, because they would always talk about needing to distance themselves from the left. You could see this in both the Borghese movement in Italy and the weird milieu around post-socialism, our barbarism, the group, not the polemic, in France and around places like La Ville, which I'm totally probably mispronouncing, but the old mole bookstore, yeah, which was a they would talk about like the problems of militancy and like how communists needed to distance themselves from both, from the left. And this moved in a lot of those circles, not in all of them, but for example, in France, La Ville got associated with negationism, which was the Holocaust wasn't that important the Holocaust didn't happen to a lot of us are regional bio-nationalists in France now in the 1990s and aughts. So it was interesting to me because we'd seen this before. And in the 90s, I had actually been really interested in the post-left anarchism debate. I remember...
there were some interesting... it means a lot of different things.
Right.
To a certain extent, it means like green and primitivist tendencies, actually.
Yeah, except for Bob Black, which is sometimes green and primitivist, but other times...
He's a special person.
Other times, whatever. But I do remember the primitivist controversies. And, if you were in the Pacific Northwest, from the Bay Area all the way up into Vancouver, Canada, you had to deal with bioregionalism, which was often represented by leftists. But that was Troy Southgate's entrance into the whole thing. And he was also associated with the post-left movement. And then you had Zerzan and that love of the Unabomber, who rejected Zerzan for being too leftist. Then you had Derick Jensen and what is it, New Green Resistance, which would if you were a leftist in college in 2004, you encountered that stuff all the time.
Yep.
Right. It was like Derick Jensen and John Searson and Ward Churchill from the Indigenous into that, and all that stuff was very alienating to me.
I can understand that.
Chomsky I liked, but the thing is that I was going to bring up is you could endorse most of Chomsky's foreign policy stuff and be a libertarian. And in fact, another weird thing about LewRockwell.com and the Ron Paul movement, they liked Chomsky's books on foreign policy. They would promote them.
Sure.
And
even like maybe manufacturing consent in some ways, as far as like critiquing the media, even though they might not share his anti-capitalism.
No. Yeah, absolutely. And so what I find interesting about this is that when I have joked kind of sort of that this Ron Paul stuff was a precursor, a real direct precursor to the Bernie movement.
It was. I mean,
People get
they're both
really
forms of
mad.
they're both forms of populism. It's just a
Mm.
right wing populism and a left wing populism, if you want to simplify it.
And they're both actually representatives of like 60s and 70s countercultural politics that went dormant for two
True.
generations. Like, because Ron Paul, came up in the 70s around the Rothbard movement, and
Yep.
Bernie comes out of the OG McGovern Rainbow Coalition, but actually a socialist.
Well, the other thing, other thing I want to say comparing the two is, both of them, from what I remember of Ron Paul, like, especially when I first got into him, he did seem, he had that public perception of being the one guy within his own party who was like saying the unpopular things that no one else would say. And it's the same thing with Bernie. Like, Bernie had this reputation of being like, oh, I get, even though he was an independent, I guess, like, he was basically like, in effect, a Democrat critiquing the shit out of the Democrats.
And we have to remember that Ron Paul was not always a member of the Republican Party.
No,
At
he was a
one point,
libertarian at first.
He was a Libertarian Party candidate.
That's correct.
So, I mean, even the idea of entering the other party to tear it apart actually began on the right, which I don't think Seth Ackerman, the writer of the Ackerman Plan, like had any knowledge of that. But it's funny because it converged in both scenarios just a decade before on the right before it did on the left. And a lot of people were surprised and kind of terrified when a lot of this libertarian shit got into Occupy, because another thing that's kind of been forgotten about was that this Ron Paul leftovers, they were involved in Occupy and tried to do that too. I mean, even up to and including the weirdest elements of it, like Alex Jones.
Another thing I would say relating Occupy to this is, in a way, I think I talk about this in my second article. Like, what you're talking about is actually a three article run.
Yeah.
And the second article, article touches on Bernie and the so-called alt-left, which it's a bit of a weird term I never used, but I took it up. And it is notable that I'm brain farting here for a second. Oh yeah, it is notable that Bernie, in a way, took up the rhetoric of Occupy, the whole 1% thing. It's basically Occupy's rhetoric. He didn't have the Occupy might have been more of an anarchist thing, but in some ways, although maybe not explicitly. But what I remember of Occupy is, maybe this is, I know my friend, but that we both know, who's an anarchist, is gonna hate me for this. But what I remember of Occupy is my dad suggested we go to an event for it. I went to one in downtown Cleveland, and it was just some strange random person barking platitudes into a microphone. We got bored and went home. But apparently there was another part of it that was more like people were actually doing these sit-in things, and then the police state got sicked against that. But people were doing these little autonomous zone-like things. That I didn't see. But the point I would make is that, yeah, this whole rhetoric about the 1% versus everyone else, like, Bernie picked that up, and that came from Occupy before him.
Right. Well, I mean, this was the thing, like, this kind of, people have made a lot of hay about how the right populists were able to steal the thunder out of the left populists because the right populists were more anti-administrative state than the left populists, right? You hear that a lot from even leftists right now. The Bunga crowd says it. That Alex from Off Bunga has even come on my show and stated that critique. And what I've actually said that's kind of interesting is this indicates that they're not Americans and are also younger than us, because I'm like, well, but a lot of that stuff actually came out of right-wing populist movements before that anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Trump as weird demagogic appeals to everything, I had been seeing developing since he quit being a Democrat in the 90s. And I mentioned this because one of the biggest anti-Trumpers that I knew, who always would accuse me since I was a Marxist of being a secret Trumper, personally, was actually a Trump supporter in 2000 in the Reform Party. So it's a very funny thing how a lot of this went. So my search for alternative politics is parallels to yours. Shortly after around we met, I got involved with the Mike Gravel campaign.
Okay, that was one of the. I do remember the Mike Gravel campaign, and
Right, the
he was
2008 one, not the 2016 one.
no,
Or
and he was one of the
2021.
people who, yeah, some of the libertarian. He had this overlap between libertarians and progressives, kind of.
Yeah, he wanted a left, like when he failed to win and failed badly to win anything in the Democratic primary. He took his ball and went to the Libertarian Party. Was like,
That's right.
maybe we can move the Greens and the Libertarians together to oppose war and to oppose the security state. And I didn't go with him because I was like, they're gonna pick some weirdo like Gary Johnson, and they did something even worse. They picked a former neoconservative who saw the way. I mean, we're talking about Bob Barr. Bob Barr? Yeah,
I
Bob Barr.
remember Bob Barr.
Who was a neoconservative signer of the Patriot Act who turned against it in 2008 and became the Libertarian candidate in 2008 against the Obama administration.
That's a weird one.
And yeah, it was very weird, and it was kind of pissed off everybody.
Yeah, it did.
Because the left libertarians were alienated. The paleo-libertarians didn't trust him because he was a former neoconservative.
Mm-hmm.
And the Randian libertarians didn't trust him because he had recanted his position on the Iraq War. So it was like nobody was happy with that dude. But I guess because he was a name and because he was associated with the Republicans, they ran him. So I jumped on, at that point, I jumped on the Obama campaign because I really did not trust Hillary Clinton.
Sure.
And
speaking of anti-war and Hillary Clinton, like from what I remember, like she was basically promising to bomb Iran when she ran against Trump. And I distinctly knew people who, like, they weren't necessarily libertarian. Some of them were. I knew some people who were like progressives, actually, or originally Bernie supporters who became Trump supporters because Trump was framed as an anti-war candidate. I think that's incorrect, but he was framed that way vis-a-vis Hillary Clinton being such a warmonger.
Well, I mean, this is the thing. Hillary Clinton's foreign policy was actually even in some ways more neoconservative on foreign policy than her husband's.
Yes.
And I was opposed to that pretty dramatically. And so, so was people like Doug Henwood. But, a lot of people on the left after Trump won really ran in the other direction. But this is jumping way ahead.
Yeah, it is jumping ahead.
But in 2008, I had been flirting with Marxism, for a long time. But I was still coming out of this long, for way into paleo-conservative world. And the biggest influence on my economic thinking before 2005 was actually Joseph Schumpeter, not
wow.
So
even
the other Austrian,
they would refer to him sometimes, actually.
Right. Yeah. Well, the thing is, they would read him and go like, "This is why we need to oppose democracy," and other people would read him and be like, "Well, this is why social democracy is inevitable." It's a very weird.
It's funny you say that because Hayek actually has a similar status. He's like, I've seen some of the Austrians attack him as ultimately selling out and being a social democrat. Well, at the same time, you see like liberals and progressives attack him as the ultimate, evil capitalist guy.
Yeah, well, you and I had talked about this in around 2012 and 2014. I was really influenced by the thinking of Philip Murawski, who very clearly painted out that neoliberalism is not what the left said it was, and it's also not what the right said it was. In fact, the thing that was really distorting about it is they kept on pretending that, like, von Mises, totally laissez-faire capitalism is what neoliberalism is, and that's never what it was. It was about, public-private markets, which von Mises thought was basically communist.
That's right. No, that's, I mean, he had the term an interventionism as an intermediary thing, but he pretty much would call anyone who was an interventionist a socialist.
Right.
And there's that famous, quote of him, calling everyone a socialist in the Montpellier Society or whatever.
Right. So I come out of the Austrian world, and Schumpeter was part of that because he was an Austrian economist, but he was not a von Mises economist. I learned a lot more about him. He was more aligned with the German historical school. And the social democratic read on him is actually probably closer to what he actually thought, but he wasn't necessarily happy or sad about it. He was more just like, this is the likely outcome that's going to happen. It's neither going to be good or bad. It's, there's trade-offs here. And that was my thought too, which honestly led me to be at first a kind of soft, like almost isolationist, soft. I want to say nationalist, although at the time I consider myself a conservative anti-racist. You can see how, like, I was never going to survive in that milieu, right? Because it's just so,
I mean, especially under the first, when Obama came into power, I would say that, what became the alt-right brood, partly as, naturally as a reaction to him being the first black president, it was the racism stuff was inflamed. And I would say that in some regards, yeah, I mean, how could you not come into conflict with those people when they were pretty much out in the open by that time anyway?
Because this is an interesting thing about the difference between the 90s and aughts with these groups, and then Obama forward and the rise of the alt-right. This is a good transition point. Those motherfuckers spoke in code when I was coming up.
Okay.
Like, you didn't talk about white nationalism, you talked about human biodiversity, which was taken from it. Yeah, race realism was later. Human biodiversity was interesting because it was both race realist, but it had taken its name and ideology from a left-wing anthropologist. And so one of the things that the far right was doing at the time was trying to code themselves as coming out of left-wing stuff so you couldn't recognize what they were. Another thing that I remember both Hoppe and Paul Gottfried, although in Paul Gottfried's case it's legitimate, and Richard Spencer all did, was claim to be right-wingers who were against cultural Marxism but were highly influenced by the Frankfurt School.
I was gonna mention this actually. Hoppe literally was a student of Habermas.
Right. Oh, here's the funny thing. Hoppe was a student of Habermas, and Gottfried was a student of Marcuse.
I didn't know that part. Wow.
And Gottfried actually took over for a special issue, Teleos magazine, the formal old magazine in the 80s and 90s of the Frankfurt School, and ran a European New Right all devoted issue to it under the influences of Paul Picone. So, like, I say the reason why people talk about red-brown shit, and I've always been like, well, it's overstated, but it's real. And people are like, oh, no, it's not real. Now a lot of those people are like, oh, it's very real. You used to tell me it wasn't real. But I'm like, it's also way older than you think. Like, this strategy goes back because when you're looking for just an alternative politics, I don't believe in horseshoe theory.
I don't either.
But there is a way in which anti-systemic groups, both left and right, borrow from each other.
Yes, they do.
In the 70s, for example, leaderless resistance, which we now associate with neo-Nazis, right? That was developed by, like, anarchists in the 60s, like, and new leftists.
Well, I was going to say, like, if we want to go even further back, like, syncretism almost inherently was part of fascism in its original form, was it not?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, not so much. It's complicated in the German case because the Strasser side lost so badly, and Hitler was basically a capitalist developmentalist, almost a proto-neoliberal. But when it comes to, like, the Italian and the Spanish case, it's the Phalange is more traditional reactionaries, but with some concessions to left-wing economic developmentalism. Although they ended up being kind of just standard capitalist ultimately. But the Italian fascists were full of fucking former socialists. They pulled largely their ranks were from the maximalist faction
Came partly out of syndicalism, right?
There's two things: the maximalist faction of the Socialist Party of Italy, which and then the national syndicalists, as opposed to the anarcho-syndicalists.
Yes,
those were the two major bases of leadership, not of membership, but of leadership within the fascist movement, that combined with the denuncio types and the futurists to build fascism. And that syncretism was there from day one. You're absolutely correct. Beyond, I mean, it's why like debates about whether or not fascism is left or right always ends up getting, yes, obviously it was more right wing than left wing.
It was right wing, but I think it opportunistically used left wing things, is how I tend to put it.
Right. And I tend to think it also opportunistically borrowed left wing ideas. Here's the thing: neoconservatism stole left wing ideas all the time.
I mean, didn't they originally come from the Democrats anyway?
Yeah, they did. But let's talk about like what they did. Reagan used Saul Alinsky as a way to spread his message.
Okay.
So Reagan, like my conservative professor of philosophy who was involved in the Reagan campaign. I'm not going to mention his name. He was a weird right-wing Hegelian. He actually gave me Saul Alinsky's book when I was a paleo-conservative and told me to read it and he actually said, this doesn't work for the left. They think it does, but it doesn't, but it really worked for us. And also we can denounce it while using it. And
okay. And maybe
he told me that flat out. Like, so
as an appropriationism of things that failed for one camp, but that actually works for yours. Yeah.
Right. They also talked about, I mean, he told me that the Birchers use Leninist sales as their main structure.
Here's another thing I will point out. Is Rothbard himself, I can't remember the article, but he actually makes an article where he praises Leninism in structure or in form. And he actually, in a sense, when you look at the way he frames anarcho-capitalist propaganda, in this particular article, I can't remember the name of it, but he literally advocates that the right-wing libertarianism movement frame itself as what's the term I'm looking for? Right opportunism. So he actually uses Leninist frames of reference sometimes in the way that he formulated anarcho-capitalist propaganda models. And it is a propaganda model. And I mean, there's a famous quote where like he pretty much admits to like inventing it almost to like deflate true anarchism. It is kind of like almost an insincere term that he came up with. But yeah, I just wanted to bring that up because there are some strange parallels, actually, not necessarily in content, but in form, between the anarcho-capitalist propaganda and Leninism, actually.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is the thing. Leninism actually is very effective for marginal politics that's militant. Yeah. I've also pointed out that in Asia, a lot of the Asian right, including Park, the former dictator in the 70s of South Korea, and every person who's ever been in charge in Singapore, also bases their political structures off of the Bolsheviks. So it's kind of funny. The thing I wanted to really get to, though, is this. We're getting into the muddle of the early Obama period, because a lot of and in a way, the Obama is a figure a lot like John Kennedy. And I don't mean, a lot of people meant that like as a praise. I actually meant it as a damnation.
Okay. I kind of figured, yeah.
Kennedy was a person that people projected upon immediately. He was a pretty rabid anti-communist who may or may not have calmed down about it towards the end of his life. I've heard all kinds of theories. And everybody from Marxist-Leninists to Birchers want to claim that right before he got killed, and the reason why the quote CIA killed him, unquote, was because he converted to their politics. So he's a cipher, and Obama was a cipher too.
And I was going to say, I mean, I get why you're making this argument because, Kennedy has this reputation as being this super charismatic guy who everyone loved. And Obama ran on really an empty platform, but just the pure platitude, symbolic platitude of hope and change. And then went on to like violate everything the progressives wanted, and they went to sleep.
Right. I mean, well, that was exactly it. And you and I remember, because this is one thing we shared, is we were always like shocked at how quickly everyone dropped the anti-war posturing. But then I was also shocked. I remember Gary Wills, who was a conservative who became a liberal because of the Iraq War. And he wrote this thing in 2012 about like the Afghan buildup that Obama was going to do, and he was like, "We've been betrayed." And I remember just going and saying to I think I wrote something to him that he never responded to. Why would he? He didn't know who it was. Where I was like, "In what way were you betrayed?" Barack Obama said he supported the Afghan war. Right now. I supported him tacitly in 2008 because I thought maybe he would be a de-escalator in Afghanistan and end Iraq. Right, that was my hope. Right, and he wasn't fucking Hillary Clinton.
Sure.
And then I remember immediately being called sexist for that. So it was like not a great. My weird.
I mean that whole thing was abused with Hillary Clinton, where anyone who opposed it for any reason was called the sexist, of course.
Right, and again in 2016, it was
especially
the same thing.
then.
Oh my God! But it was and people who want to know how I voted in 2016, I didn't. So I tried to.
People are really going to hate me for this, but I've never voted in a presidential election. I've been tempted to, and maybe you could point your finger at me and blame me as like, oh, ha ha ha, Trump happened because of you. But
where do you live?
I'm in Ohio. It is a red state, but I'm in Cleveland, which is like a blue island of a red state.
Yeah, maybe I could blame you for it if I was a progressive, but
yeah.
I mean, look, I might, except for 2008, I might as well have not voted ever. I tried to vote in 2016. What happened was all the voter laws shifted, and it was very hard to get a ballot through in Georgia. So I know my ballot wasn't counted. So you honestly, don't blame me.
Honestly, though, like I've never so much taken the moral argument against voting, which some anarchists take up, which is a little silly to me. Because it's almost maybe not down punching, but like blaming the powerless citizen for their own oppression. Kind of like, ooh, how dare you oppress your neighbor by voting? Like, I don't buy that so much.
But it's not like if everyone stopped voting, the government would just go away.
No, it wouldn't. It wouldn't. That's absolutely true too. It'll just punch you in the face anywhere. So it's like, okay, whether you voted for it or not. But I approach it more as just from a cynical, practical perspective of just like, oh, none of these people can enthuse me very much, and I know how I've seen enough cycles of things fail for me not to be enthused.
Well, it's interesting. If people were to look up my voter record in Utah, and you can't really look it up in Georgia because you don't declare party in Georgia the same way you have to in Utah. You can declare party if you want to, but what you actually do every year was declare what ballot you wanted, and that was it. But in Utah, you have to register as a party to vote in their primaries, at least in the GOP one. Actually, you can openly vote in the Democratic one, but I have changed my voter registration like 5 times since I've been here to vote strategically locally for union stuff.
Okay. I mean, I get that. Even my dad, who was like, he was pretty much a progressive liberal, but he voted for Republicans on occasion for strategic reasons, actually.
Yeah, I mean, well, if you're only voting down to, if you're a leftist and you're voting down ticket on everything, you're captured. You're a captured member. Like, so you just fucking be a normal fucking center of the road Democrat anyway, because that's what you're really doing. But my point on that is I think I've voted for a Republican once in my life.
Okay.
But it's still like in 2008, I voted for first Mike Gravel in the primaries, and Barack Obama. And I told you I immediately regretted my vote and wanted to go back into anti-systemic politics. And then as the recession was happening, and then Obama didn't do anything about it. I mean, like, it's not that he did nothing, but he bailed out the banks and didn't restructure it in a way that helped people. And in fact, every point of inequity that we saw that got exacerbated from the Reagan, the Bush years went gangbusters during the Obama years. And this is not really dealt with. The inequality in the United States went crazy in the recovery under Obama, even more than under Trump. And that was something that I think really threw a lot of people. But when I was reading your piece on Trump and then Bernie, I kept on thinking about Dan Carlin. People who follow the podcast, The Verse in the broader, know that Dan Carlin's an old history podcaster, used to be a political podcaster, was originally a libertarian, not of the variety that we're talking about, but
maybe a Cato White.
He was Cato, but also like he was for immigration restrictions and immigration reform, but he was not one of these deport people. He wanted like some kind of way for people who were already here to. It was a very like
center, kind of in the middle of the spectrum somewhere.
Yeah. And he was for a long time. He was opposed to public sector unions, and then Wisconsin scared him. But what's interesting about him, and I bring him up because Trump depoliticized him, and I bring it up because he had been a person who kind of been on. He wasn't all the way on the Ron Paul train, but he was kind of on the Ron Paul train. He wasn't on the Bernie train, but he was supportive of it in 2016. But at least as an alternative politics, maybe it can change the Democratic Party. But Trump scared the shit out of him. And he basically left political commentary when Trump won and just did historical commentary. And the reason why I think what happened was what you describe in your three pieces. And I'm going to link all of them in the episode. I'm going to let you talk about more of it. But basically, he realized that Trump really was a demagogic anti-systemic politics. That he had gotten part of what he wanted, and he didn't actually want it because it was actually worse. And so
that makes sense, because in a sense it's true of Trump. It's like he was a alternative politics that actually won in a sense, except it was worse.
Right.
Like it made things worse.
I mean, and here's the thing, like, I always found it interesting what people were afraid of Trump. Like, a friend of me of the show, Douglas Lane, and I used to argue because he was afraid that, like, Steve Bannon and the paleo-conservatives were going to run some right-wing Keynesian scheme and we get, like, fascism or whatever, which is a far cry from where he's at today. And what I said to him at the time was, like, A, that's not possible. And B, I mean, and in some sense, the MMT schemes have been run by Republicans since Reagan. But the other thing that I was pointing out to them was that Trump's, and Scott Horton, of all people, I had him on my show. I'd followed him since I was a right-winger. He's from the antiwar.com days.
I remember.
He used to be an anti-Trumper. I think he's now on that bandwagon. I don't know. I haven't talked to him since I interviewed him when I first had him on my show here. It was one of the two right-wingers I've ever had on. But one of the things that he and I both noticed was Trump would say everything to everybody. And I was like, you can listen to a Trump speech and you can hear a neoconservative and an anti-war and a pro-war and an anti-police and a pro-police.
See, that's the thing I didn't pick up on until a little later. Mm-hmm. Just the degree to which Trump really is like a Rorschach test, in a sense. Because right now, for example, he's positioning himself as super pro-Israel and trying to pander to Jews. He's trying to pander to black people as well. He's super pro-war, but he tries to position himself as in paleo-conservative terms in some ways.
He's super pro-war in Israel, but not. I mean, I will say this: he seems to be war-verse for Americans, but he has no problem with other people fighting wars.
Yeah.
Um,
So he's for
and
proxy wars, yeah.
right, like and so when people are like, "Oh, he's different from Obama," I'm like, "Dude, his bombing campaign and his drone campaign,
Didn't he do something with Libya?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
intensified." He also assassinated a key figure in Iran.
That's right. That's right.
But my point about Trump is, yeah, compared to Bush or Reagan or the neoconservatives, yes, he's a relatively peaceful president, even compared to some Democrats. I mean, I'm not going to lie about that. But right now, for example, if you're trying to vote on Palestine,
He's no good.
yeah, good fucking luck picking anybody.
Yeah.
Like, because if you know, it's going. You know, we know where Trump's going to go on that. Like, he's actually
He's positioning
doubling
himself
down.
as more pro-Israel than the Democrats. Yes.
Right, which is one of the things about him is about the alternative, the search for alternative politics is we already know that he's willing to make concessions to neoconservatives because he did. He motherfucking put John Bolton in the State Department.
Yeah.
You know, one of the biggest ghouls of the Bush administration.
And what we're seeing right now is, you know, the part of the alt-right who actually is like super anti-Semitic is opposing him because he's so pro-Israel.
Yeah, I
And
mean
then the
that
people
goes
who
from
actually are hardcore white nationalists are like, why are you not just like saying let's ban immigration for all non-whites?
I mean, this is a funny thing. Like, apparently, and I don't say this as to the mean or defend them, but both Angela Nagel and Richard Spencer were Joe Biden people. So
Were they?
yeah, because Biden maintained the Trump border policies, and you know,
Yeah.
I think Spencer has come out against Trump for his Zionist stuff, but so I think Candace Owens may be heading that way too.
She does. She gets it, and I guess even though he's not a political figure, Kanye West does this weird gambit where the Jews aren't the real Jews, but
It's Black Israelism,
yeah,
but weirder.
yeah, it's
Actually,
really fucking weird. I don't even know how to describe it.
so one of the things that your piece on the Bernie and the Trump scenario is that the Bernie bro accusation kind of felt like, in hindsight, that it was a weird self-fulfilling prophecy. That, like, liberals chastising certain relatively priorly unpoliticized people for supporting Bernie ended up making them moving to the right more attractive. That's part of your
I
thesis.
think there's truth to that, and I personally knew quite a few people who like they were originally Bernie supporters. But then when it was clear that Bernie not only lost and got kneecapped, but especially when he would turn around and like kiss the ass of those who kneecapped him, in a sense. And this is something I kind of agree with Jimmy Dore about, actually.
Me too.
And then they were like, okay, so he's like betrayed us, and Trump won. And Trump was running as a populist too, although more incoherently than Bernie, perhaps. They swung to Trump. And I've even saw someone go from being a Bernie supporter to like a dark enlightenment type.
I saw multiples of that. I mean, this is the thing. I worked with people. I'll talk about it since he's now dead, and I've talked about it in public. Paul Shetler was a friend of mine, good friend, who had come out of the post-left anarchist world into the Occupy world, and he had helped me publish. In fact, he's the person who put me in contact with Mark Fisher and actually commissioned the article on Russell Brand, and had the series of debates between me, Jody Dean, Michael Rectenwald, and Sam Chris. I like to point out that, like, almost all of those people have been canceled by somebody. So Jody Dean for Stance on Palestine, Sam Chris for sexual misconduct, Michael Rectenwald for, well, having a public breakdown and becoming a reactionary. I mean,
He did have a public breakdown. Yeah.
right. Yeah. And I guess people have tried to cancel me too, but it's for a variety of things. But none of it's really stuck because most of it was false.
I mean, I if you want to put it a certain way, C4SS tried to cancel me.
Yeah, well, this is a weird thing about C4SS, right? You and I was never a member, but I remember in 2010 when I was first moving abroad, still following them and noticing how many of them have moved from like the Roderick Long form of left libertarianism to something more like traditional Prodonist mutualism.
Yes.
And, you know, they'd gone through the Carson gate, and a lot of them were like, you know, more, they were no longer anti-Marxist in the same way that a lot of them have started out as.
That's true to a point. That's true to a point.
I mean, some of them still are, but
but if we're talking William Gillis, he was actually always super anti-Marxist and super anti-communist. And what happened a little bit later, I think 2012 and later, he took over.
well,
and they but
yeah,
go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
But yeah, from what I remember of that, it's true. There's certainly an element of truth that there was this. Kevin Carson was kind of a door opener for people, and so was Sean Wilbur. And it was Sean Wilbur who was actually like a Proudhon scholar, who would do nothing but talk about Proudhon. He still does.
Right, and I remember those guys also being like, and I went like, I don't talk about it much because I hate them when on the rare chance I encounter them on the internet. They're some of the most annoying people in the world. But Henry George was a figure that I was initially attracted to in like 2005, 2006.
Yeah, and you do get some people taking up Georgism too.
Right. And Georgism is weird because if you're a libertarian, and you believe in the non-aggression or the non-coercion principle, but you realize that John Locke is full of shit on how we got property in the United States. Henry George is appealing to you, right?
That's true.
Because you're like, like we can own property, but we can't own land.
That's right. Another thing I found weird about Georgists, though, is like some of them are like, it's almost like a single issue politics. Like, yeah, they believe in the single tax, but they're also conservatives on every other issue. Like, I've met that kind of Georgist too.
Right. Well, what is interesting about Henry George himself is like Henry George and Marx were competitors, but like Henry George praised Marx upon his death.
I could see that.
Right. So, like, when you actually go into the history, and I remember this was a gateway drug for me out of paleo-conservatism, is we talk about classical liberalism, and I would realize how many of those classical liberals were socialists. Like, they were. Like, pre-Marxist socialists. Like,
yeah, absolutely.
So I just realized that, like, classical liberalism is a much more broad and weird thing.
It is. And the way I've come to think about it is, you know, it's kind of internally split between its elitist side and its socialist side, or its egalitarian side, let's say.
Right, and basically Marxism pretty much erases its egalitarian side from history. He just does it after Marx and after LaSalle, which is the other form of kind of state socialism that emerges. I don't think Marx is necessarily state socialist either, but you know what I mean.
I do want to partly agree with you about C4SS, but also push back because I ended up being critical of them in some ways. But it's true that a lot of them started veering leftwards. Some of them got into more like social anarchist territory. But my longstanding critique of them always was like they would do that and yet still be allied with like ANCAPs and Libertarian Party people. Or they would propose syncretic philosophies trying to put Ayn Rand in conversation with Marx. Like Schiabera did that.
Right. I remember that was a weird tendency. Is like, we're going to reconcile Ayn Rand with Marx. I'm like, you can't do that.
That was my critique of them ultimately, was like, okay, you guys sound like you have one foot in the door of social anarchism and your other foot, you're still ANCAPs.
Well, the reason why I wanted to talk about the Spectre of alternative politics with you is not just to, like, you and I are some of the few people who agree that Bernie is actually a precursor to Trump, but also a postcursor to Ron Paul, even though his politics, I do not think would ever have been that way. Sure. Like the anti-political mood which led to a search for an anti-systemic politics, has manifested on both the left and the right. And one of the things that you and I agree on, against the way most liberals and leftists talk about this, is that the right has been fragmented since the middle of the Bush administration, and Trump has not fixed that. He's just papered over it by being a demagogue. Like, there is no coherent ideology to, you and I have gone back and forth about whether or not we would consider Trumpism fascist, but I told you, like, he's a demagogue in such a way it kind of doesn't matter.
Well, what I would say is that, I mean, I get into this in the most recent article, is in a way the thing with Trump is that he became someone for people who probably actually are fascists to project their desires, their sick fantasies onto. And so in a way, in a way, the concern was with Trump was less Trump than some of the most radical wing of his supporters. And I do think that Trump himself has escalated power. Don't get me wrong. I think Trump has escalated things into a worse direction. And I do think that, like, there are aspects of his politics that you could probably call neo-fascism. But the other point I've come to make is that, in a way, you just can't do traditional fascism in the U.S. because it's such a not egalitarian but cosmopolitan society, relatively speaking. That
Right.
someone like Trump inherently has to pander to Jews and black people.
Well, this is one of the things that I pointed out to people about why I was never afraid of white nationalism, because the old white nationalists themselves, and I'm talking about Sam Francis. Sam Francis said that white nationalism was a dead politics in America because of demographics, and that what you actually had to do was create a meaner middle class counter elite that would serve white interests, but also black and brown interests, as long as they were against immigrants. So that strategy was staked out by a white nationalist who got kicked out of the National Review for his politics in a document that was found on a floppy disk from the 90s.
And I do want to point out that, like, some of the people involved in the paleo-libertarian camp that were pretty right-wing, like, I saw back then even, they would selectively ally with black nationalists sometimes.
Oh yeah.
They would actually have some Latino allies. So there is an almost inherently incoherent nature to it, where Entryism is part of it, I guess, as well. And, like, it's, I don't know. When I look at the alt-right now, I do see it as more incoherent than I originally understood it, because it's like, they have gay people, lots of atheists too. So you can't just, like, tie every single right-wing cultural tendency together in one big thing. It just doesn't work. So it ends up splintering. Inherently, it ends up splintering.
Right. I mean, what we see, if people want to see this, look at European far right stuff. They don't agree on shit. Like,
and I even remember, like, the TradCon. I remember the people who were, like, pretty much white nationalists. They had conflicts with traditional conservatives, but they would ally with them as, like, their people on the ground, kind of.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, see David Duke in the Republican Party.
Right.
Even in the Reaganite period, right? Like that wasn't totally unheard of. And I guess the one of the things that your three pieces got me to think about, other than both of our mutual political histories, when we talked for an hour and a half, in a way that almost was narcissistic, but in a way that I think should put things in perspective for those people who really want to do alternative politics in the future. One, weird shit like MAGA communism is not new.
No, it's not.
It is absolutely not new. And it's not just LaRoucheism. We noticed you and I have not gone back to LaRouche, which is probably the first, or the largest of the weird hybrid movements. Although in some ways the neoconservative movement, which did outreach from Skip Jackson Democrats into former Trotskyists and former Maoists, that people always drop the former Maoist part. And it's interesting. This is an interesting side note. The number of people on the Marxist-Leninist left who have picked up paleo-conservative talking points and conspiracy theories about neoconservatism is pretty like striking.
There is an overlap.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of
I even noticed it myself in some ways, where, like, in some ways, like, when the whole Ukraine thing happened. Like, I don't know, I kind of have mixed feelings about it, but I found myself in some ways like leaning on these critiques of the U.S. Imperialism, but then when I thought about it, I'm like, wow, this is like these talking points I'm seeing from the left. Like, it's the same thing as what the Ron Paul people were arguing.
Oh yeah.
It's the same thing.
This is one of the things where people always go like, a lot of these hybrid people want to win me over because in some ways I'm a figure from this milieu. Literally, I'm one of the people who track from right to left, and that's so fucking rare. But two, it's why I smell it on people sometimes, and people who don't even know they're doing it, because I'm like, oh no, I've done this before myself.
Right.
Like I remember what this was like. Like when I ended up in Pat Buchanan, Lou Rockwell, Ron Paul land, if I told you what I believed now about like American foreign policy imperialism and what I believed then about American foreign policy and imperialism, they would be pretty damn close to the same.
Pretty similar.
Yeah.
And I feel similarly about myself. It's just like, even though I wasn't necessarily paleo-conservative, like I feel like I see a parallel in. I'm much more of a leftist now, but like I see a parallel there where it's like, yeah, it's much the same thing. Maybe some of the framings are different. Maybe for the libertarians, it would betterly be. You might better call it, a capitalist anti-imperialism or something. But it is kind of a capitalist anti-imperialism.
Well, one of the things you point out in your second article, I guess we've been kind of soft on the burning people, but you pointed out that there's an implicit nationalism in a lot of those people that they don't ever fully embrace themselves, but it opens the door for people. You talk about that a lot.
Yeah.
So you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I do think that's important. I do think that the methodological nationalism of a lot of social democratic policies like pretty easily go to.
Well, I think I read something you yourself wrote in criticism of Barbara Einreich. Am I
Yes.
Barbara? Not Barbara Einreich, Catherine Liu, rather. In which you pointed out that a lot of her politics is basically just soft nationalism.
Yeah, well, I mean, basically, what I said it was like it wants its Fordism back.
And yeah, that's correct. I did see that.
And Fordism is an inherently nationalist project, people. So like it's not a hard nationalism. It doesn't. I mean, Henry Ford was a hard nationalist. He was a fucking Nazi. I mean, literally. That's not just me disparaging him. But if you look at where Fordism ended up, you don't have to be, a hard right nationalist or even a right-wing nationalist at all. But it's methodologically nationalist in a way that makes it possible for you to see that. And one of the things that you and I have both quietly been talking about is how much nationalism is on both the left and the right anti-systemic politics right now.
Yes, and although it's a little easier to argue that like Biden is obviously a nationalist, or Heather Cox Richardson is
they're
obviously
clearly nationalist.
I had a whole article on her too, but that's its own story. But that's something that's very easy for me to point out. That I think people go silent on that too with me, where it's like, hey, like, have you noticed that Biden is actually like positioning himself as a U.S. nationalist? It's just liberal nationalism, basically.
Well, I mean, what is the difference between Biden and Trump's policies? There are some substantive differences, and not entirely the same. I don't want to pretend that they are. But on immigration and on tariffs in regards to China, the difference is, are you working with the administrative state or are you pissing it off?
Yeah.
But the policies are remarkably similar.
Like, and there's just like in the rhetoric, there's this desperation, relating to China and Russia of just, it's this competitive international politics of, how do we keep the U.S. on top? That's all they're concerned with, basically. How do we keep America the number one economy in the world? And they're still kind of failing.
Yeah, absolutely. But
as far as Bernie though, like, I mean, didn't he advocate kind of protectionist policies like
yes,
Trump?
He did. I mean, Bernie is Bernie is not a nationalist in the sense, but his social democracy is protectionist. It is not, properly speaking, even classical social democracy. It is kind of a post 68 Harrington. All right, the guy who first argued for left populism after Max Shachtman ended the SPA was Michael Harrington. And it was before the DSA even fucking existed. It was when he was justifying trying to get on the McGovern campaign between 68 and 72. And going back into the Democratic Party at the very moment the New Communist Movement was kicking up. But the New Communist Movement, like a lot of the weird return to sectarian leftism that you see today, exhausted itself incredibly quickly, right? And the reason why I found your three essays so interesting is I wanted somebody who didn't believe in horseshoe theory to still point out how this anti-systemic politics was not just a left-wing phenomenon, and that the left and the right have been stealing from each other.
Absolutely.
This entire fucking time. And if we build back, we can see it in smaller and smaller movements after the new left and the new communist movement dissolved in the late 1970s and early 1980s.
Yes.
And once you see that, like, all of a sudden, the trajectory of American politics makes sense once you add in one key world historical event, which was the fall of the Soviet Union in 1992.
Yeah, that changes a lot, doesn't it?
Right. It changes almost everything. And it's also, I mean, weirdly, I also think it's why, for example, vulgar Marxist Leninism is so popular right now, because people realize how much bullshit they were sold by anti-communist Cold War rhetoric,
sure.
but then they just invert it.
Then they invert it. That's correct. They invert it. Another parallel that I bring up in these articles is the nostalgia factor, which is that, for example, in the case of Bernieism, he appeals to nostalgia for the FDR days. In the case of Trump, it's America first. I mean, it's kind of similar time period, really.
I was about to say, it's actually, it's the FDR days as understood by actually living in the 1950s.
Right. I get what you're saying. I mean, it's the FDR days, not as understood by Gabriel Coco, who I cite as giving a critical spin on that, but yeah, as understood after the fact through the liberal consensus, right?
Right. And it's weirdly, Trump is also,
and he's looking in a way, it's the isolationism pre-World War II period that he caters to.
Right, but he likes the economy of the 1950s too.
Yes, that's true, but without the policies per se.
Right. Well, the thing is, though, Trump is not a neoliberal. The weird thing about Trump is he empowers these people who want to take away all these social benefits, but he himself is not inclined to do that. I will actually say,
I mean, he's kind of inconsistent about it.
Right. Well, he wants to keep, this is the thing with a demagogue. He wants to keep them in a coalition, but he knows if he actually gave them what they wanted, it would collapse their popularity in America forever.
Well, the main inconsistencies I saw is, he sent the big fat socialist checks out before Biden did. And the protectionism thing, which is, if you're a free market libertarian, like, that's a big no-no.
Right.
That's a big no-no. But I'm not sure I would say that he's like super interventionist necessarily. I mean, he still is cool with, a lot of things that are somewhat similar to Reaganite policies, I guess. But he is more protectionist, and he, in some ways, yeah, he is willing to, like, intervene in a way that, like, the libertarians would totally reject.
Absolutely. I guess this actually leads me to ask you another question. What do we see now? I mean, one of the things about Bernie that you don't get a whole lot into, but that I actually think is pretty substantive, is the social democratic left was more up on him in 2020 than they were in 2016, mainly because, I mean, he was a more known factor. But at the same time, he lost worse in 2020 than
he did.
And Jimmy Dore, you and I have talked about this. Like, I think Jimmy Dore is guilty of a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, incoherent fusion.
No, he's super incoherent, and, like, he caters to mostly a conservative audience, really, if you look.
At least now, yeah, he didn't used to, but
yeah, at least in the last 4 or 5 years.
But my point about him is he wasn't wrong about Bernie and the squad, and he was onto it early, and I'll give him credit for that.
Sure.
The issue that you have, although I would say that like he kind of sees it as sheepdogging, I see that as sheepdogging, but I don't think it was intentional. I think that they really somehow think that they can play this gambit. Maybe not with AOC, but with a lot of other people. But
at the very least, it's saving face, right?
Right. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about is what do you make now that both Trump and Bernie and all these people are more or less establishment figures? I don't see how they're anti-establishment politicians anymore.
No, they can't be.
Right.
But Bernie is like, what is his position technically now? Like, I guess there was this big thing where like, well, from what I remember, Biden promised to integrate him into his administration and like integrate his policies, which mostly didn't really happen as far as I could see. And in the case of Trump, like, yeah, I mean, how could you say he's an anti-establishment guy when, I mean, part of my whole take on him is that, like, yeah, it makes a certain level of sense to say that he was an outsider because he had not previously had political office, and you could say that he was in ill repute even among capitalists. However, like, he is still like within the economic system an elite. And he, he talks shit about, Jewish capitalists, but that's just his competition.
Right.
That's just his competition. But he's functioning just like a career politician, really, when you look at him, especially in his most recent campaign. It's like, yeah, he's just a career politician, and I've even seen videos from right wingers who are like, they think that he's been taken in by the deep state.
Right. So it's just always how, if you're conspiratorial inclined, you would explain it. And for me, this is the problem of anti-systemic versus independent politics. All right. You and I are both critics of the way a lot of these people have made concessions to the Democrats, despite the fact that we disagree on certain people. We agree on a lot of the stuff. But you and I both are like, well, these people who are liquidating these leftists who are liquidating themselves into the Harris campaign, this is deeply embarrassing.
Yeah, it is embarrassing. I mean, oh my God. I mean, the same people who would have accused me of being too liberal 4 years ago in some ways, now I get to accuse of being too liberal. This is weird.
Yeah, exactly. It's deeply embarrassing, and it's pretty deep in the DSA, and I kind of actually think one of the dangerousness of anti-systemic politics versus independent politics is it's easy to think that you can go into these organizations and regimes and just like make them better because you got the right person in there.
And I guess that goes to a lot of what my cynicism towards electoralism has always been. It's just yeah, let's just try to invade the party. I mean, even when I was a libertarian, there was these weird arguments of like, yeah, they would try it with the Republicans. Like, yeah,
absolutely.
let's do entryism into the Republican Party, and that's kind of what Ron Paul was.
Exactly.
And what happened with Ron Paul? Like, he had like what 1% of a chance to win.
Yeah, I mean, Bernie did. One thing we have to admit that Bernie and Trump went way further than Ron Paul.
They did. Oh, they did.
But Ron Paul actually did sort of set the game that whether they meant to or not, that they used. Right, rebranding towards younger people disaffected by politics. Using very good sloganeering, like
a lot of sloganeering. Yes.
Appealing to foreign policy so that people don't pay attention to your domestic policy. Although Bernie didn't do that, to be fair to him. But I think that was a lot of that in the case of Ron Paul, and there's been a lot of that now.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't understand this idea of like, if you live through the Obama years, especially, of like suddenly being like, what as far as I could see with the Harris campaign, like, especially once Walls was introduced, and I do see like, okay, like I get
Ross is actually kind of a progressive, but still,
he kind of is a progressive, but it's like all of a sudden people are like doing pure vibes politics from what I see.
Absolutely, the politics of joy.
It's just like joy, and it's like this just reminds me of Obama, and I try to remind them like what happened then.
It's Obama, but less, but even in some ways more cynical, because Harris did poorly in her actual primary, because when she has to face off between the contentions between Democrats, it shows where the faults in the party line are. If you skip the primary process, the faults in the Democrats aren't exposed. Like, and I think this is going to be a weird time. Like, she's only 2 points ahead in the polls, which is better than I predicted she'd be. But it's and I would say now odds are in her favor, but barely.
But no, you're probably right. I kind of try to stay away from predicting things because we've seen things swing around.
I've been so wrong lately because everything's so fucking weird. So
things swing around quickly, but no, yeah, I think you're right that there's been an uptick for her.
I mean, at this point, like, I could easily see like a comet, like, just taking out both candidates or something, and like us having to start from scratch.
Sure,
fucking crazy.
And I am seeing that there's a lot of infighting in the Trump camp apparently.
Tons. Well, the thing is, a month, 6 weeks ago, Trump had been the most disciplined I'd ever seen him, and as soon as Biden stepped out, he lost the fucking plot. Like,
I mean, when I saw that failed assassination attempt, at first I was like, he's won the election.
Yeah, me too. And then the RNC, you saw him pivot strongly away from Project 2025, which I don't think he ever fully endorsed anyway. You people know my stance on that.
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much agree with your stance on it, although I will say that, like, the upshot of it does seem to be that, yeah, they want to, Trump wants to cement his legacy permanently in some way through other people, is what it seems like.
And other people do believe it. That's the thing. Like, Trump doesn't, but there are people that he wants in his coalition who really do mean some shit in there.
The two biggest concerns I have with Trump's current campaign is he does seem to want to give the religious right everything they always wanted.
Well, except for a total national abortion ban. That's the one thing he doesn't want.
Okay. But, he's basically promising them, and I think the liberals took this a little out of context when he's like, you won't have to vote again. He's not saying that he's going to abolish voting, but what he is saying is that he'll give the religious right so much that they won't ever have to worry, basically, in future elections. And the other part is, like, he does seem to be promising some libertarian wet dreams, like abolishing the Department of Education and in the EPA and shit like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's all. I think the EPA threat's actually serious. I also ironically think, like, them talking about how much of a pro-worker party they're going to be when you actually read what's even they've said, not just what's in Project 2025 about unions. It's like, dude, you want to take us back to before? It's not just before FDR. It's like before 1890.
Yeah, pretty much.
So
yeah, they're talking like going pretty far back on labor law. Yeah.
Oh, they want to completely do away with child labor protections. They want to make federal labor law optional at the state level.
It's pretty wild. But I do agree with you that Project 2025 is a wish list for neocons, paleo-cons, and libertarians in the religious right that are all kind of incoherent. They can't possibly implement all of it. So
it would collapse the economy, and the military would take over. I keep on telling people this. So,
but I mean, I do understand why people are concerned about it. But it is kind of like the rhetoric of, like, check out Project 2025. It's going to end democracy. Like, my other cynicism is, like, we don't really have democracy anywhere.
Right. Oh yeah. Absolutely. And yeah, I think that leads me to a good place. You and I think, would argue that we need an independent politics, and right now, I am not telling, and maybe you would, but I'm not telling people right now that we never need to be electoral.
I'm not telling people that either, actually. I'm not. I'm just very cynical about it, but, like, I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to a properly constructed workers' party.
Oh no,
And
me
not,
neither.
and I don't mean like a Labor Party in as far as the watered down version they have over in the
I mean,
UK.
like the Labor Party of like the early 20th century.
Yeah,
Like,
I mean like a real and you know, I kind of think the idea of workers' councils is pretty nifty, but um, that's its own story. But
right.
I'm not 100% opposed to electoral politics. But the only thing that would get me excited about voting would be something like that, basically.
A viable Labor Party, which I think we could only build if we both look. And I mean, this is such a fucking liberal cliche, but it's actually kind of true here. Globally and locally at once, and forego just trying to skip all that and just go directly to national politics. Because one of the things that I noticed is people learn the wrong lessons from the issue and localism of the Gen X and Boomer, post New Communist movement and the hippies. They just like, oh, we just need to take over the executive, and I'm like,
Mm,
no, you got to build an administrative state apparatus. You have to build local things of power. You have to have multiple coalitions. You need like you
yes, and
need
that's the other thing I wanted to emphasize is that like even if you do electoral politics, no, like you have to do a tons more things that aren't electoral.
right. You can't just do canvassing for fucking candidates. Sorry, right wing of the DSA. You
Yeah.
really have to build it's not just reviving the union movement, which honestly, like by itself is okay. It's not a bad thing to do, but
No,
it
it's not.
wouldn't lead to much. Um, and I know that's probably an unpopular thing to say, but like labor union bureaucracy kind of sucks. And both
It
like
does.
we,
And like
as I talk,
I mean, let
go
me
ahead.
try to square this out, parse this out a little, because it's like I'm pro-union, but I
Me
am a
too.
little cynical about them too, because I've experienced the only unions I've ever been part of were run by conservative guys, or at least like liberals who were just kind of nice guy union guys who were way too friendly with the corporation anyway and didn't help me at all. So
Right. Well,
I'm a
this
little
this
cynical about that.
I have seen like in the teachers unions. I have seen good teachers unions. They're mostly in the Midwest, but they kind of suck.
Yeah, I just remember
Otherwise,
when I was working at Giant Eagle, like there was this union guy, and like when I actually had a legit complaint and I called him, he just like met me in the office with the boss and like played nice guy and did nothing, basically.
and during COVID, a lot of the unions actually. And this is, I think,
And it
this is
was during
particularly
COVID.
damaging. Yeah, we're actually probably, um, if I'm completely honest, uh, I had better luck with HR because they were more afraid of being sued.
Mm,
And that's a very damning thing.
yeah,
And that's not all unions. I think that actually has led to the like democratic union movement and like trying to seize the unions from a lot of these old nice guy people. But the problem that we have with that is in the tale of the two Seans, as I said to Sean, of who is not one of the two Seans. I mean Sean O'Brien and Sean Fain. Um, Sean Fain of the UAW, who kissed the ring with Biden way too early, and Sean O'Brien, who kissed the ring of Trump. And it's just like, I think Sean Fain has way more tactical independence than Sean O'Brien does, to be completely honest. But the thing is that neither one of them really truly needed for the larger labor movement to kiss the ring yet. They need to do, I mean, they probably gonna have to do it one way or the other, but they both seem to do it kind of prematurely and in different directions. And I think that's something you have to sit with. And then when you see like, leftists who call any labor union who has to deal with a Republican a fascist. And I'm like, dude, labor unions locally have to deal with Republicans all the fucking time. I
yeah,
don't know what you think happens. It's clearly you've never actually been involved in a union or a union pack. And so this idealization of it doesn't really help it. And I think also the labor movement has to be larger than the formal unions. It
sure.
really does. And so this is not me taking a totally anti-statist stance. Like I said, we have to do what we have to do at a local level. But like, um, this is where I'm at.
just to be clear, and I know Sam's not going to love hearing this, but like, I'm not sure. I haven't like hung my hat on identifying as an anarchist for some years, but I do still use anarchist frames of reference. I'm still inspired by some of it in the way I think. But I'm much more like I've caught up on Marxism a lot more. In a way, I describe myself as trapped between anarchism and Marxism, to be frank.
Well,
Which may sound funny to people, but I feel trapped between anarchism and Marxism. But as far as like, yeah, let's press the magic button and abolish the state, like that's long gone a thought of mine. That's long
yeah.
gone a thought of mine.
Well, I mean, I don't even think the Sam you speak of, for those of you who are listening, is Sam Kangaroo. I mean, he's an MMTer. He doesn't really think we can just press the button and abolish the state either.
I don't think he thinks that either.
The funny thing is, almost no anarchist I know does that. What I worry about, and what you and I have talked about, is
there's also the opposite, where you're just a social democrat anyway. So why call yourself an anarchist?
Right. It's like you're an MMTer. You voted for Bernie. You endorsed the Democrats. Why are you a fucking anarchist again?
I mean, speaking of Roderick Long, he actually had an article. I think I linked it in one of my pieces, calling Chomsky an Augustinian anarchist. Over that, because it's like he points out that, and I've talked about this for a while. I was like, well, I'm not like an anti-Chomsky guy. Like, Chomsky is the one mainstream anarchist who like doesn't really present as an anarchist. He just presents as a Democrat, and he always tells people to vote for Democrats. He's good for foreign policy analysis, and he's good for labor history and things like that. But it's like he basically is a social democrat, and I think that a lot of anarchists since the 60s have been like that, really, where it's just like, you're basically just a social democrat. Anarchism is just kind of a radical aesthetic, or like maybe people like Vosh or say, who think that it's like, yeah, maybe 1,000 years from now we get to have an anarchist society, and it's like, well,
which by the way is a further out anarchist claim than even Marxist would make.
Yeah. But I don't believe, as I've told you before, I don't believe, do we call him Vaush or Vosh? However you pronounce it. Like, I don't believe I never was convinced that he was an anarchist. And especially once the Biden administration came in, I'm like, whoa, dude, like, you just sound like a neocon or something.
Yeah, we're in a weird space. Well, I would tell people to read your 3 pieces. I'm going to link it down, and I hope it gives your Substack some eyes.
I just started it last month, so it is like a slow crawl. I'm just getting used to this Substack thing. And what I noticed about Substack is like, it is mostly people who are like professional academics and media people who have much more followers than I'll ever hope to probably have.
Well, Substack is a way for people who have lost their job in traditional media to maintain
I could see that too. I could see that too. But I'm approaching it as just like, I've been out of the game of blogging for a while. I used to have a YouTube and I no longer don't. But I have been a writer, but like, why just like put it out into the void of Facebook when I could have like a proper article format place to do it at?
Well, the interesting thing about Substack is just, I'm like, okay, so it's slightly better than WordPress. But since it has an email mail out to it, it's more efficient and it's monetized better. But it is weird because I'm like,
I used to do WordPress too, so
yeah, me too. I was a blogger for a long time. I only completely gave up blogging in 2021, and that's because like if I'm going to write, I should probably just write a fucking book. So
and I know you're working on one.
Yeah, I'm working on a book. It might come out one day. I'm actually working on 3 books: a book of poetry, a book on cholesterol ashes in the back burner, and then a book on weird figures in the last 25 years to get resurrected on the left. So what we're talking about now.
I mean, I've written so much, and I'm a fast typer and a guy who writes a lot, that like I probably could have written a bunch of books by now. But as far as the Substack, like, yeah, I just view it as a better platform than me whining on Facebook, essentially.
Yeah, I'm hoping that the decline of social media for print, even in the case of X, leads to a return to decent blogging, even if it's on Substack. Yeah. So,
and hey, like I've only been doing it for a month, and I've already pumped out 6 full-length articles, and they are like 20 to 30-minute reads according to the estimates.
Yep.
which
Yep.
is not exactly friendly to our current social media environment, but it is what it is.
Yeah, it is. So people should check it out.
Yeah,
Anything
and
else
I
you'd like to
encourage
plug?
people to check it out. I'm sure you'll link it and everything there.
I will. Okay, well, thank you so much, and people should watch your Substack, and take care.
Good talk.